So, in our daily practice for clinical cytology, I think our major job is to determine the presence of malignancy and the origin is this coming from. So, this is the first patient who is an 82-year-old female and with pleura effusion. Sometimes the clinician only send very scant material, so we only receive 4 mm liquid specimen, and then we do a cytospin. So because of these very rare, very scant material that we receive, we don't have a very cellular specimen. However, there were still some atypical looking cells. So the clinician didn't order a cell block, but Dr. Gao was alerting her because he checked the history and he ordered a cell block. So in the cell block, we do have a lot of these glandular cells. So in the cytospin, it was not very apparent. It was some cluster of atypical cell. Initially, the screener coded negative, but sometimes if the specimen was very scant, you receive a very scant specimen. Ideally, you should shake it with the vibrator or the instrument that we use to make it more homogeneous, and then you do the cytospin, you will have more cell. Otherwise, there would be very scant material in the original cytospin, and if the clinician didn't order the cell block, then we will miss the initial diagnosis of a cancer. So the case was tested for TTF1. It is positive for TTF1. So this is the very first specimen. The patient in our hospital, she's already 82, so very old. So it is kind of important that we can identify it at the beginning. However, when we do the stem for the diagnosis, we only have very scant material. So this is the recast section. So we need to denote that for the cell blood, there were only very scant tumor cell. If the patient still have pleura effusion, the clinician should go ahead send it again, not only 4 mm, but should be more. And the second specimen is also something like we would need to think about clinically. So again, this is the first specimen from this patient. She went to our chest department outpatient clinic because of the abnormal chest x-ray. And then she was admitted to our ER immediately, and so we received the specimen. It looks like positive. And we do have a lot of tumor cells. The cells forming these tight cluster 3-dimensional architecture with prominent nucleoli. So this looks like adenocarcinoma. In our cell block preparation, we do have a lot of tumor cells. But for TTF1, it turned out to be negative. So because we do have a lot of material and the patient is only 53, so I think it's better that we can check the status. We can check POXA to confirm that this is coming, maybe coming from the gynecologic tract. Otherwise, the patient would be possibly spend in a wrong department for a long time, then find out that the original tumor is coming from a different location, and that would be not good. And because we do have a lot of material, so for RECA IHC, we would still have material for the molecular testing, so this is okay. And because of her initial presentation with the chest X-ray, it shows that shrinkage of hemithorax, just the half of the lung was shrinkage. So the pattern is also a little bit weird. So we can also check the calcitonin to confirm that this is not mesothelioma. The morphology doesn't look very much like mesothelioma because the nucleus is somehow very high grade, and we do have a lot of bubble in the cytoplasm. But because of the initial presentation, and we are already going to do the scan, so we will also check if the lesion is negative for creatinine. So rarely for primary lung adenocarcinoma, there would be TDF1 negative. However, it is a middle-aged female, non-smoker. The possibility was relatively low. It's very unusual to have a TDF1 negative adenocarcinoma. So I think we can do to help to confirm the origin of the metastatic tumor, and then we can help the clinician don't waste a lot of time to do a lot of unnecessary like a procedure. So the next specimen is also relatively unusual. It is a EUS guided biopsy specimen. So it is coming from the mediastinum. So the patient has a widened mediastinum, so they do a EUS guided biopsy via esophagus. So in this specimen, because it is coming from esophagus, so it is unlike the usual like a duodenal gastric biopsy that we would see. So you will see the normal mucosa of this location, which is squamous cell. So you see squamous cell, which is okay because you know this is coming from the esophagus. And then in the background, we do have these tight, large cluster of cells with vesicular chromatin and distinct nucleolus, and arranged in this three-dimensional architecture. So if we are thinking about mediastinum for the primary tumor, most of them were unusual, like thymoma, germ cell tumor, etc. But this actually looks like adenocarcinoma, so we also need to think about the possibility of metastatic adenocarcinoma. So because the patient also have concurrent biopsy specimen, and Dr. Gao already stated it is positive for TTF1. So this is likely metastatic primary lung cancer to the mediastinum. I'm not so sure why they do the mediastinum biopsy at the beginning instead of doing the original like a location biopsy, but this is relatively unusual. We rarely see this type of specimen. So EUS guided biopsy can approach a lot of different area. It can approach, for example, sometimes rarely you will receive a liver biopsy through the stomach on the other side, opposite to the pancreas, and you will get the liver biopsy. We rarely receive that, but in some other hospital, they do receive the specimen like that. Yeah, and esophageal biopsy, we also rarely receive that. Usually when we receive that is that the patient had the mediastinum lymphadenopathy that is very difficult to get a biopsy. Usually for that type of patient will be lymphoma, but in this patient it's actually metastatic adenocarcinoma. So the next specimen is a pleural effusion specimen. This is coming from a patient with non-history of lung cancer. So this is compatible with metastatic lung adenocarcinoma. So next one is also a pleural effusion specimen coming from a middle-aged female. So this specimen is paucicellular with a lot of proteinaceous material in the background. we do have very, very scant atypical cells. The patient had a non-history of breast cancer. So because the cell is very big, you see, we have a reference cells over here. This is a lymphocyte. You see that on TV, yeah. So this is huge. So this is likely malignant tumor. But we don't have a lot of material. So here, another cluster of cells. On this part, it looks just relatively atypical, but however, if you compare with the normal cell, this is just too big. Very similar to the prior specimen of the pleura effusion. So the patient do have a cell block preparation. Also very scant. And the pattern is a little bit unusual because most of them were single cell. So because the original tumor was diffusely positive for GATA3, I think it's better that we can check it is still positive for GATA3. So we would do the immuno for this case. So the next case again is a primary lung adenocarcinoma with pleura effusion metastasis. So this is compatible with the morphology of lung cancer. So next, we do have some other unusual metastases. This is coming from pleura effusion with very high-grade, poorly differentiated cells. This is malignant. It looks like poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. The patient has ampulla vata adenocarcinoma. So this is coming from the duodenum. And the morphology is compatible because the patient already had a history. So this is compatible with a very high-grade adenocarcinoma and compatible with the patient's history. The next one, again, pleura effusion. So also very scant. And we only have these like relatively plain-looking cluster, but with three-dimensional architecture. So we've already seen the specimen from the patient, and we already studied. The patient had a remote history 5 years ago. She had a colon cancer, and now she had a huge lung mass. So the clinician was thinking about second primary lung cancer, but it is positive for CDX2. So we already know this is positive for CDX2, so this is compatible with metastatic colon cancer. So as you can see today, we have a lot of metastasis in the pleura cavity, coming from the duodenum, coming from the colon, and coming from the breast. So lung cancer is not the only possibility. Occasionally, we can have a primary presentation with pleura effusion, but coming from the gynecologic tract. So we really need to help our clinician. If the patient had a clinical history, it is okay. If it is a new patient, maybe we should help the clinician to work up these a little bit more, to spend some time with additional unnecessary treatment. So again, pleura effusion, and this is coming from a patient with a history of parotid cancer. So this is a salivary gland cancer. And the morphology is a little bit unusual because you see the cell is wrapping with very flattened a shape around the entire like a cluster. So this is more like a squamoid looking instead of the usual adenocarcinoma. The only adenocarcinoma that would be more common to have these type of morphology would be primary breast cancer with metastasis forming the cannonball pattern. So originally the salivary gland carcinoma is positive for P40, so possibly myepithelial origin. So the patient already had multiple recurrence. So this is compatible with the prior history of salivary gland carcinoma. So this cluster, this looks like adenocarcinoma, but the other cluster looks more like a squamoid feature. So this is relatively uncommon. So we already have 5 different locations with PURA metastases. So this is very, very common in our practice. And we need to always remember when we first have a malignant diagnosis, if the patient doesn't have the history, or if the morphology doesn't match the history, maybe we should work up a little bit more if we have additional material. So let's move to some other usual US guided biopsy from the pancreas. So every Thursday and Friday, and we will have a lot of US guided biopsy, sometimes even more than 10. So this is our routine practice because majority of the time it is adenocarcinoma. So this is a diagnostic for adenocarcinoma. You see necrosis here, you see highly atypical cells with cluster, and this is easy for us to make the diagnosis. So around 90% of the time we will see the specimen like this. So the next specimen is also very similar. It is a little bit less cellular, but we do see these highly atypical cell in cluster, some necrotic debris as well. And so this is also, again, easy for make malignant diagnosis. However, occasionally we will see some specimen is a little bit difficult to make diagnosis, which is well-differentiated adenocarcinoma in the pancreas. This is one of the most notorious entity in small biopsy specimen. So for this case, initially we do not see any like a normal contamination of the intestinal type of mucosa. Here we do see a piece of stromal cells. This is likely, these can be from the smooth muscle wall of the duodenum, or this can be desmoplastic stroma. Maybe a little bit more muscular. So here we do have some dot by the cytotech. So this dot, this is actually indicate more likely to be benign acinar pancreatic tissue, because you see these very small cells with nice acinar arrangement. So majority of the dot by the cytotech looks like benign. So this is also looking like benign normal acinar cell cluster. We do have some necrosis over here. So where is the lesional cell? The lesional cell is actually very, very, very bland looking. This one. So thinking about endocervix, thinking about pap smear, what we won't see in the normal pancreas tissue is this type of mucinous mucosa with oranginophilic mucin, with gastric type of mucin. If you see the mucosa like this, along with the extracellular mucin material, this is quite abnormal. So this is likely coming from IPMN, and with can have invasion, but the cell is very bland looking. This is super bland looking. But if you think about cervix gastric type adenocarcinoma, when you see something like this, you might have some alert. So here you start to see some atypical cells, relatively atypical, with a little bit more crowding. So these clusters actually represent likely the well-differentiated adenocarcinoma. So this is the lesional cell, okay, not the like a very benign-looking. These are acinar cells. These are from normal pancreas. So in this specimen, I would say these very well differentiated, but abnormally with these like abnormal gastric type differentiation. These are likely the lesional cells. So however, for these aspiration specimen, we do see these atypical mucinous cell. Again, this is another cluster. And it is very difficult for us to call these malignant out front because we don't have any more like a typical change supported diagnosis. So Dr. Gao decided to sign out as suspicious, which is perfectly fine. And in his concurrent biopsy specimen, he was able to call these adenocarcinoma because he had an invasion, he had the architecture pattern. So for the cytology, I think when we are in the pancreas, you need to think about the possibility of the well-differentiated adenocarcinoma or the dysplasia like coming from the IPMN with various degrees dysplasia. So this is the direct smear of the patient. So again, these relatively like a bland looking mucosa, this is likely a well-differentiated adenocarcinoma because of this abnormal like a mucin production. Again, this one, you see, this is not normal mucosa in the pancreas, for sure. It doesn't have these mucinous type of differentiation. So this must be neoplastic. And if this has invasion, this is adenocarcinoma, but this is very, very well differentiated. So the lesional cells is a little bit different from people would think about. So next one. So this is this is coming from lung. So it is a middle-aged female coming from the lung, but the patient had a history of breast cancer. I think for this specimen, it's a little bit difficult to determine if this is metastatic or if this is primary. I think by morphology, it is likely primary because of these. We do not see typical feature for breast cancer, and in some of the area we also see the pseudo inclusion. So primary lung adenocarcinoma it's more easy to have pseudo inclusion. So I'm thinking maybe this is primary, not the metastatic breast cancer, but still we need to have the IHC confirmation. We will wait for the or it has already been scanned. But anyway, the patient has 3 different cancer: breast cancer, gastric cancer. So if the patient have breast and gastric cancer together, the most likely clinical syndrome would be the one with loss of beta-catenin. ECAD-HIRI mutation, and it will resulting in both lobular carcinoma of the breast and the signaling cell carcinoma of the gastric. And this morphology doesn't look like that. So I think the pathology with these core needle biopsy may be already standing for TTF1, and this is positive for TTF1. So in our practice nowadays, it is very, 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 very common that we will see the patient have three different kind of cancer, so you always need to think about the possibility of second primary. The practice is getting more difficult, but we are also evolving with our diagnostic tool. So the next specimen, neck lymph node biopsy. So on low power, we do not see like a tight cluster of the cells, which suggests metastatic cancer. However, when we go to higher power, we do have a lot of very big and atypical looking lymphocytic cells. So if you take a look of your reference mature lymphocyte over here, these all looks abnormal and with bizarre like nucleus with irregular membrane, a lot of notches. The chromatin is much more open. The shape is not rounded, it's irregular. So this is consistent with large cell lymphoma. So this is likely a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which is the most common type of lymphoma. And we can do CD30 and CD20 and CD3 to confirm this is majority of the large cell would be the B-cell lineage. This is the second biopsy, second aspiration of the same patient. The prior specimen was sent out as a typical. So maybe we can take a look to see if that was diagnostic at the beginning, but yeah, this one's diagnostic. So the next specimen is coming from parotid. So low power, not very cellular. We have a lot of debris-like material in the background, but we do have very good flattened fragments of oncocytic cells. So this is diagnostic for Warthin tumor, right? So this is nicely flattened and with oncocytic appearance. So this is consistent with Warthin tumor. Exam.
Okay.
This one is too easy, but yeah, this will be next week in your exam. And this, if you are wrong with the question, I'll be very pissed off. So the next specimen. Okay, this one is also interesting. This is coming from the lymph node. So we have a papillary epithelial cluster. Oh, 学妹撞到了，还是怎么样？花心什么代志？整个显微镜闪动了一下，诶，有一个卡榫好像歪掉。你刚有撞到吗？没有，有吗？好像不是，是下面这个，应该是这一颗。好 ，OK。So this is it looks like papillary thyroid carcinoma. So the patient indeed had the PTC history, but it was a case with prominent poorly differentiated component. So the patient had the poorly differentiated thyroid carcinoma derived from a papillary thyroid carcinoma. Both component were BRAF positive. A little bit strange that this area still looks like well differentiated PTC because of this prominent papillary architecture, but the patient indeed has the recurrence of disease. Uncertain why they are still well differentiated component here. 真的那个轴好像歪掉，可能要请他再来帮忙。这个为什么这个会这样？
哦。
所以它倒了就对了。可是它还是太不稳了，这个要请他再来锁紧。
它今天刚好会来。
哦，好，这个这样不行，它整个轴歪掉了，对，谢谢。OK， 都一直在晃，好可怕，好怕倒下来。OK。I think that's it for today. Okay, thank you. 对。